Hello, everyone, and welcome to this dialogue examining the Canada-US supply chain. I'm Matthew Forte, the president of the Accelerate Alliance, and I'm very pleased to be joined by my collaborator in this initiative, Albert Gore, the executive director of the Zero Emission Vehicle Association, ZETA. Exponentially increasing demand for EVs is driving the need for a robust and efficient EV supply chain. So in short, the EV market is moving very fast. So developing the market's foundational supply chain also has to move at speed. The upstream and the midstream need to be in position to meet the downstream industry where they are and where they're going. All of this is happening against the backdrop of enormous geopolitical uncertainty and dominance by China in most aspects of the battery and EV supply chains. So there's a critical security and supply discussion to be had. And of course, the other dominant influence in this discussion centers on industrial policy, most remarkably the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, but also Canada's recent federal budget, coupling strategies like the Critical Mineral Strategy, the Canada Growth Fund, et cetera. Add to this a long history of alignment dating to the Auto Pact through NAFTA and CUSMA or USMCA. And this all sets the stage for action and investment, but doesn't set the stage for coordination and collaboration. That's the dialogue we'd like to have today. What we'd like you to walk away with is a better sense of the opportunity within the Canada-US supply chain, the context within which the supply chain is developing, and priority actions that are being taken or maybe that should be taken to better coordinate our approach to this fundamental and historic industrial shift. Now, there are many facets to this supply chain, and this conversation will lean a bit towards the upstream and the midstream, but I'm sure we'll also touch on manufacturing, assembly, technology, and other aspects. The truth is there's obviously more to discuss that can be covered in 90 minutes, and we look forward to returning to those issues in subsequent conversations. So we set up today's dialogue in three parts. First, we will welcome Andrew Miller of Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, who will provide his perspectives on North America's role in the global EV value chain and share his thoughts and analysis on why this is an important conversation and what Benchmark is seeing in terms of supply chain development. We will then move on to a conversation that Al will facilitate between US and Canadian policymakers on how each country sees this supply chain developing and the current state of dialogue. Finally, I will facilitate a discussion between business leaders operating within the US-Canada upstream and midstream supply chains who will share their experiences and their perspectives on what a successful cross-border industry could look like. Throughout the conversation, we encourage you to type in your questions using the Q&A function. And indeed, please feel free to carry on side conversations with using the chat function. There'll be time at the end of each discussion for some questions. With that, I'm very pleased to start today's dialogue and welcome Andrew Miller to brief participants on Benchmark Mineral Intelligence analysis and perspectives on the North American supply chain. Andrew is the Chief Operating Officer of Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, where he oversees Benchmark's supply chain research and analysis. As a reminder, there will be time at the end for some questions, so please type those in. And now, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, guys, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I've been asked to provide a bit of a macro overview, I suppose, of the state of play as to where we are in terms of building out North America's battery supply chain. So I'm going to run you through some of Benchmark's latest data, try and highlight where we think the most work is needed, the type of capital expenditure is needed, and then sort of summarize why this is so important, not just to the automotive ambitions of North America, but also the clean energy ambitions of the market going forward. So a brief bit about Benchmark. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a market intelligence and price reporting agency focusing specifically on the lithium-ion battery supply chain. Everything we do is focused around following the raw materials coming out of the ground right through to the battery cells that are finding their ways into electric vehicles. And we provide a wealth of different types of data and information services that you can see here. And if you'd like to find out a bit more, you can see that on our website, benchmarkminerals.com. I wanted to kick things off by really summarizing where we are in this story of lithium-ion battery adoption. I think we're standing in 2023 at the start of a new chapter in this story. And really that's probably the fourth phase of this build out of the lithium-ion battery market. The first of those being the sort of initial shift from lab scale concept to a commercial reality of lithium-ion batteries. We then progressed in the rollout of those batteries to a number of primarily portable devices, your laptops, your phones, tablets, these types of applications. The third chapter, I think, really began when we started to introduce scale. So the beginning of the Tesla Gigafactory really sparked a race to build battery production facilities that were an order of magnitude of anything that came before them. And really the past 6-7 years now has been a story of the build-up of that scale, the achievements in terms of improving performance, bringing down cost, and really making these batteries available to mass market transportation. Where we stand today in 2023, we believe the market will this year for the first time overtake the 1 terawatt-hour threshold in terms of battery production. So a real significant milestone and a signal of how much has been achieved in that push towards scaling the industry. The story of the future, and certainly through to 2030, we believe, is going to be how you continue to enact that scale, you continue to bring scale to market, but you tackle the supply chain turbulence that risks actually disrupting some of the economics around these batteries as we move forward. And I'll come on to show you how that turbulence really now is shaping the economics of the push towards electrification. As I say, that push towards scale has been all about unlocking the potential of batteries in transportation. And now what we have is every major automotive company around the world making significant commitments to electrify their fleets. When you partner that sort of industry momentum with what we're seeing at the policy level, what you see is that we're moving into a new generation whereby in parts of the world, such as Asia, such as Europe, you're actually by 2030, we project we'll see more than 50% EV penetration rates by the end of the decade. In North America, that still remains a little bit lower, but we're expecting by the end of the decade that we'll see around 1/3 of all vehicles, or 1 in 3 of every vehicle, to be sold to be either battery electric or plug-in hybrid. So a huge shift in the shape of the automotive industry. And really, as those automakers try and scale, we're now just beginning to see what will be a multi-year process of the diversification of battery supply to fuel that push towards electrification. So automakers have got to grips with where they need to position their batteries, where they need to build out supply in more strategic parts of the world, which will feed into their EV ambitions. And we're, like I say, just at the start of that process, whereby we diversify away from, in particular, China, where a lot of this battery scaling has taken place, and you start to see the US play more of a role, parts of Europe, other parts of Asia, and that's really where we are today. So if we think about, what's needed to meet those type of ambitions in electric vehicles, we did a bit of analysis just in terms of if we look at where we see supply coming from by 2030 at each step in this supply chain, and how much of that supply will be centered, in this case, in the US market. What you see here is that actually EV makers have done a pretty good job of orientating battery supply to be roughly in line with where they're projecting to get vehicles on the road. So you have a lot of pipeline capacity for battery cell production itself now here in North America. What hasn't caught up, and where the real race is still to be run, is in the midstream and in the upstream, whereby the market share, we're estimating the market share of North America will be a significantly smaller proportion than the downstream ambitions of the region. And as you can see here, we did some recent analysis. We're actually putting out a really nice infographic over the next couple of days, so look out for that. But really looking at where CapEx is going to be required along the supply chain in different parts of the market. And what you see here is, if we look at this just from a North American perspective, we're expecting upwards of $60 billion will be required to fill that supply chain gap. So a huge amount is needed across the supply chain. And I think the real critical step, which has maybe in some cases been overlooked, particularly as we've, since the Inflation Reduction Act, seen this overwhelming tide swing towards, what do we do about raw materials? actually the midstream in many cases has actually been overlooked in that equation. And if we start to develop the raw materials, which we certainly should here in North America, the question becomes at the moment, we need that capability to refine those materials into battery grade chemicals and battery grade materials that will support battery cell production. So a huge amount needs to still be done in the midstream and the upstream of this supply chain in North America. Why we need to look at that today is really because time is running out. Actually, the most time-sensitive parts of this supply chain are the further you go up, up towards mining and extraction. When you think about the typical lead time to develop a new mine or extraction or processing facility, you're looking at in the region of what we put here, 5 to 25 years. But the reality of that is that we're by far trending towards the upper end of that range, particularly as we try and move this production to new parts of the world, some of which might not be particularly mining jurisdictions. You also layer on top of that the sustainability, the requirements that are being put on new producers coming into the market. All of that sort of kicks the can down the road and means that we are facing much more stringent hurdles as we try and bring on the upstream of this supply chain and we try and move it towards North America. So that money and that capital I mentioned on the previous slide needs to start moving pretty quickly. And if we look at where we are now, it's not to say that nothing is being done. And I think I picked out a few of the key raw materials here, your lithium, cobalt, and nickel, just because they show quite differing stories. Each of them talk to some of the challenges that different parts of this supply chain are going to have to overcome. If you look to the left here, which is last year, where we were last year, and then we showed 25 and 2030, but the light blue bar that you see on the right-hand side represents nickel, and how if we took all of the nickel produced in North America and equated that to how many EVs could be produced with that nickel, what you see is we're massively, oversupplied in some cases. But of course, in the case of nickel, batteries isn't the #1 market. So the vast majority of that nickel isn't going into the battery industry today, it's going into industrial applications. So while we have a relatively solid supply base for nickel in North America from what's produced in Canada, as you take this and extrapolate this out over the time period, what you see is that relatively static supply picture for nickel actually quickly turns us into a deficit when we look at the steep curve being faced by electric vehicle ramp up. At the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the other side of that chart in the dark blue, what you see is the proportion of lithium. And I think this is a really positive story, because lithium is, of course, a part of the industry where North America has some really fantastic assets. And you are bound, every part of the world is bound by its what it has geologically. And lithium is a case whereby we certainly expect that more and more lithium will be produced and extracted here in North America, because there are already some top quality assets. But as you see, we're still underperforming, even though we're improving this picture, whereby today we could only cater to about 10% of EV requirements. By 2030, we're still at a deficit from where the EV market is projected to be in North America. So work still to do. And then very quickly, I think I might be coming up on time. I don't want to go on for too long, but very quickly, why this is really increasingly important in the story of electric vehicles, and why raw materials are, at the forefront of battery economics these days, is that if you think about what an electric vehicle is, it really is just a big battery. The #1 single largest component, cost component going into an electric vehicle is the battery. And if you think of that battery as a pack, a management system, and a number of cells, the overwhelming proportion of cost for that battery comes from the battery cells. You then take that one step further and think about what goes into each one of those battery cells, and all the economies of scale that I mentioned at the start, all the improvements that have been made in the battery industry over the past 5, 6, 7 years have led us to a case now whereby the bill of materials going into that battery cell are the vast majority of the cost. Last year, up to 70% of the cost of producing a battery cell was coming from your bill of materials. So that bill of materials, those group of critical minerals and metals, are now at the heart of EV economics and EV competitiveness for companies that are looking to remain at the forefront of the automotive industry. And that means that, you know, automakers are being tasked to now follow the path that's being set by policymakers. Yes, we need more clarification from policymakers. Yes, increased momentum, but things like the Inflation Reduction Act have set a really strong precedent for where this industry is moving in North America. You now have automakers that are accepting we have to move up the supply chain. We have to have more control over our cost base to remain competitive. And that's forcing them, as you can see on this chart, to look into parts of the supply chain they never would have ventured if we talk about traditional combustion engine vehicles. But more importantly, we're now being geared to do that regionally in different parts of the world. And what this shows you is that those investments now, as they take that step up the supply chain, isn't just about supply security. It's about doing it regionally, doing it sustainably, and following the path that policymakers have now set and continue to set and clarify over the years to come. So with that, I hope I didn't go too long. Really appreciate your attention, and hopefully I've left time for one or two questions if there are any.
Andrew, thank you very much for that. So you have left some time for questions, and we've got one in the chat. I've got one maybe I'll ask before that, and I encourage others to send some questions in either by the Q&A or the chat. Maybe I'll start now. I don't know if you've got a question to Andrew as well, but you had talked about sort of time is running out at the front end of your chat, and I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and what you mean by that. I mean, you know, is it because of regulatory pressures, or is it just? I mean, look, obviously you've got the climate imperative behind all of us, of course. But I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that and how you interpret the time aspect of this.
Yeah, so timing is really critical, and you know, when we talk about that range of how long it typically takes to develop a new extraction mining operation, you know, that's really from greenfield. So there's a number of assets that are multiple years into that development timeline, and that means that hopefully they can catch up this big growth story that's coming on the horizon. But I think what we need to be aware of is, certainly from a policy perspective, is that actually we're making it harder for some of these new operations to come to fruition, and that is pushing us towards the upper end of those development timeframes. And when we get to that upper end, we're really up against an even more significant battle to start to meet some of these raw material requirements. So it's like I say, it's not all doom and gloom. It's, you know, you have fantastic companies speaking a bit later who are doing a huge amount towards bringing some of that new capacity, and they're multiple years into their development processes. But this doesn't happen overnight in mining, and particularly when you try and take mining, you know, yes, in terms of Canada, a very mining friendly jurisdiction, one of the best in the world. If you look south of the border, quite a different jurisdiction to deal with. And I think when you talk about building this out across the region, we need to work where there are strengths, you know, across the region, and understand that maybe in some parts of the supply chain, Canada might be a bit more, Canada might promote some of its mining practices a bit more, but we can also learn a lot of lessons from that. And I think policymakers need to learn, how do we change this from a regional perspective to be that we're not just dependent on one part for the upstream and one part for the downstream. What can we do to sort of support it on a regional basis?
Yeah, I'll say we've talked about this before. The lament in the U.S. around how long it takes to get a mine up and running is a very, you know, upfront conversation. It's the same conversation that's being had in Canada, and it's interesting that Canada is sort of seen as maybe more progressive in that respect, but that's still a dominant conversation here. I mean, it does take time. The question in the chat from Roger. So can you speak a bit to graphite mining and supply for EV batteries, particularly in North America, where we've had it compared to the lithium story?
Yeah, absolutely. I think graphite, and it wasn't intentionally left off, but with 10 minutes, I didn't have a time to rattle through everything. But graphite is a really interesting case study whereby you have, particularly when you think about the industry and the control and the dominance China has over the supply chain, there's probably no part of the supply chain where China has a more dominant position. So in terms of supply chain security, we need to start thinking about graphite very seriously. On top of that, you do actually have some real structural issues facing the graphite market, whether you look at the natural graphite side of the market, whereby because of the nature of the way graphite is mined and extracted, you can only use certain proportions of that for the battery industry. There's only a certain part of that that's going to be relevant for the battery market. So it's a much more complex business planning sort of a process those natural graphite miners have to go through. And on the synthetic graphite side, it's the way it's done today is an incredibly energy intensive process, which arguably, offsets a lot of the positive environmental impact that these EVs will be making. So when you talk about bringing that here, a lot has to be done in terms of technology, so that when we diversify this production around the world, we can do it, but we can do it in a more sustainable way. But we also need to get ahead of the curve of where some of these minerals and metals that don't get the same attention as the lithiums of the world, where they're situated. Because the reality of the industry is that, yes, we can put all our weight behind lithium, but you can't make a lithium-ion battery or an EV just with lithium, right? We need a lot of different minerals and metals to make this work. And graphite, particularly if you think about the anode side of the equation, graphite is pretty much the mainstay. Yes, there's a bit of silicon and other types of carbon products, but overwhelming and for the foreseeable future, graphite will be the dominant material on that side of the battery. So yeah, doesn't get the attention that it deserves, but is really essential to the clean energy ambitions and energy storage ambitions of the country.
If I could ask just one more question, we've got 1.5 minutes left, and it's about the investment side of the equation. I think pegged it at $60 billion to meet in the upstream and midstream to meet the immediate downstream need, or at least I don't know what the time frame is. It's 5 years or something like that. Obviously, huge injections of funds through government programming, the IRA most prominently. I wonder if you could talk about the private investment side of things and what you are seeing from the markets and how they think about this broad industry, particularly the upstream and midstream, and what the conversations are like these days.
Yeah, so they're far more nuanced, and the positive of that is that I think there's a lot more understanding around the supply chain. But with that said, I think, when you think about public markets, there's still the short-termism that wants to get drawn into where's the price of lithium today, or what's going to be the sort of 12-month horizon for this stock, as opposed to what's the 10-year horizon for this commodity. And I think that's something that has really forced the industry to step up, right? When you look at the billions of dollars that are being committed now, they're going to come, significantly from either, people active in the industry or the downstream consumers of these materials. Yes, government, I think, is a really positive direction to have government funding go into some of these parts of the supply chain, because ultimately, like I say, that sort of sets the path and it gives the confidence that this is something that's going to grow. But I think if you talk about where the overwhelming majority of that capital has to come from, it is going to have to come from industry, from consumers, and hopefully more from public markets. And I think more confidence and more of an understanding of the realities of this battery industry are going to be really critical. I think people tend to get swept away by the latest headlines of the day around, is the whole market moving to one type of chemistry, or are we going to be completely displaced by a different type of battery? The industry doesn't work that way. And as I sort of said at the start, right, if we think about 30 years plus into this sort of lithium-ion battery story now, we're only really just entering that fourth chapter, only really entering this sort of mass market part of the story. That's taken the best part of 30 years. Yeah. You're not going to displace that. You're not going to shift the whole industry this year, next year, or the year after. So the sooner I think external stakeholders can get to grips with that, the better for everyone.
Terrific. Well, listen, Andrew, thank you so much for your briefing. Really, really helpful. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Al to introduce our next panel. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Andrew. Very, very grateful to have you present to us. That was a wonderful presentation. So I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Albert Gore. I'm the Executive Director of the Zero Emission Transportation Association. And our next panel is about what's happening at the federal level between the United States and Canada. And we have two fantastic panelists with us today: Stephen Boyd, Acting Deputy Director for Batteries and Critical Minerals in DOE's Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains, and Kimberly Lebois, the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Mineral Policy and Critical Minerals at Natural Resources Canada. Thank you so much to both of you for being with us today. It's a big topic of what's happening at the federal level between the United States and Canada, but in this particular context of the zero emission vehicle supply chain, critical minerals, and batteries, there has been a lot of recent activity. Canada is our largest trading partner. Billions of goods and services exchanged every year, supporting millions of jobs on both sides of the border. But this industry in particular, I think presents an enormous opportunity going forward. And there have been a lot of recent developments, funding for the Canadian Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund, the Strategic Innovation Fund, shared investments in workforce development, an updated joint action plan on critical minerals cooperation to work together on R&D, and on the future of the critical mineral supply chain. There's also, a shared focus on working with First Nations and Indigenous communities, tribal nations in the United States as part of this conversation. So I would, first of all, love to get your view on how policymakers in each country really think about the North American opportunity with regard to the zero emission vehicle supply chain. And Stephen, why don't I start with you, and then I'll have a follow-up for Kimberly.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Al. In terms of how people are thinking about this, I think what I would start with is both the investments that have been announced in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure law, specifically our office, manufacturing energy supply chains at DOE is rolling out programs to invest $6 billion, actually over $6 billion, supply chains for batteries. So we made 21 different selections announced this past fall, and we'll continue to work on releasing further announcements that are supporting the supply chain, right? But in addition to that, right, there's a lot of sort of supporting work that is in the Inflation Reduction Act, both in terms of tax credits and credits for some of the investments that will be made to reduce prices along the supply chain. And so I think both of those, that there's interest in developing out the battery supply chain in the US, and I think putting the money on the table is a pretty clear indication of support, and definitely something that is near and dear to the work we're doing here.
Great, thank you. And Kimberly, I would ask you the same question. How do you view the North American opportunity, and where does it fit within the domestic policy priorities that the Canadian government has today?
Thanks so much, and very, very happy to be here today with folks. So we're incredibly fortunate in Canada. Like, we're very well entrenched as a partner of choice with the US. This is reflected in US domestic legislation that treats Canada as part of the US industrial base. And so our countries, we're natural partners. Like, we share the world's longest undefended border. It was mentioned that there are millions of dollars in trade that cross the border every single year. In fact, in 2021 alone, there was over 94 billion in two-way trade just in minerals and metals alone. And Canada is already a supplier or source of future supply of critical minerals and metals to the US, including nickel, graphite, which was mentioned in the Q&A earlier, copper, cobalt, and rare earth elements used in electric vehicles. So, we've already got a really strong base that we can build upon. And, certainly with major investments made and to come in critical mineral and battery supply chains in both countries, there's a need to promote complementarity in projects and incentive programs that address key gaps and build on successful cross-border integration in this sector. And we've got positive examples of this that's happening already. And some of these examples are, General Motors is building a $500 million facility in partnership with South Korea's POSCO in Quebec, which will produce cathode active materials for GM's Ultium battery manufacturing plants in the US. 5N Plus is a leading global producer of semiconductor and performance materials. They announced a commercial agreement with Rio Tinto to refine the tellurium that is produced at its copper operation in Utah, and it will be refined at Rio Tinto's facility in Quebec. North American Lithium is a joint venture of Sayona Mining and US-based Piedmont Lithium, and they're expected to supply Tesla with lithium from their facility in La Corne, Quebec, beginning later this year. So lots going on. And we have this mechanism called the Canada-US Joint Action Plan on Critical Minerals Collaboration. So this was renewed in March 2023. So we gave it a refresh, kind of said, let's take a look at what we're doing and where we're going. And through that, we can absolutely ensure mutual benefits. We can jointly address security and defense concerns related to sourcing from countries of concern. We can facilitate greater trade and investment, and we can increase competitiveness for the US and Canada. So I really see it as a win-win scenario, starting with domestic policy and moving into regional North American policy.
But Kimberly, I'll ask you a different question, which is somewhat in follow-up to what you just spoke about, really involving government coordination. So you mentioned some of the frameworks that have been put in place. Are there things that you would like to see in the future to promote better coordination as some of the policies within the IRA come into effect that do encourage North American supply chains for things like critical minerals and battery components, though approaching battery components in a more stringent way and really trying to focus exclusively on a North American supply chain over time for those parts. So what would you like to see in the future? What's on the horizon to encourage better coordination?
So first of all, thanks for the question. And I really hope Stephen does manage to rejoin us. But I think we're on a good track, and I think we really need to continue enhancing collaboration at all levels. We need to work with all stakeholders, with industry, and with international allies to successfully take advantage of what really is a unique generational opportunity for us to move forward. So like nurturing and enhancing our key alliances are going to be vital to our success. And, the US-led Mineral Security Partnership, it was announced at PDAC, so the Prospectors and Developers Association conference in Toronto in 2022. Canada and the US are working with other governments in this space and the private sector to develop new projects while meeting high environmental, social, and governance standards, which I think is key. Like ESG is no longer a nice to have. It is becoming essential to have as we move forward. And under a new work program of the International Energy Agency, Canada, the US, and other members are examining ways to ensure the availability, security, and responsible sourcing of critical minerals. So there are multilateral mechanisms that we can certainly leverage to our advantage here in the US. I think taking complete advantage of the Joint Action Plan is also a really good thing for us. And, the Defense Production Act, Title III, there's a lot of work, there's in-reach right now into Canada looking at mining companies as a source of supply for US for national defense purposes. And certainly there's a lot that we can do in that space to work together to ensure that, we are building those economies on both sides of the border, both for, the extractive piece, but also for the components, the refining, the advanced manufacturing, and all of that good stuff. We've got a good relationship in the automotive space that we can certainly build upon. And welcome back, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And welcome back, Stephen. I did not attempt to speak on behalf of DOE in your absence. You'll be happy to hear. But the question that I was going to ask you initially was just looking at the policymaking of the last 2 years, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IRA, focus on permitting reform, shortening timelines for upstream in the battery supply chain. How do you see that shifting the domestic supply chain and as it relates to the North American supply chain, if we're going to view it that way?
Sure. And it's what I was going to refer to earlier was the type of work that was, I think, being emphasized just in our lead up here, which is a lot of the permitting and reform is, I think, really impactful for the type of mineral sourcing and processing that's needed to establish these supply chains. So both in terms of the work that we're rolling out and the types of projects that we've selected for building out a domestic supply chain for batteries, as well as in some of the other announcements that are, I think, continued to see released really a broad base of support from the types of minerals and materials that we need. And it seems that that those sort of efforts, both in streamlining permitting, as well as really focusing on meeting the needs of these materials and trying to motivate what we have around them. It's helpful. It's gaining steam, and it's I think pointing in the right direction that there is a base of support in North America and including the U.S. right to do this type of work, and that's what we'd like to see to try to really build out our capacity we have to produce these materials domestically.
Sorry, I was muted. The recent debt limit agreement contained some new provisions intended to streamline the permitting process. There also, in the last couple of years, within the FIPSI Fast 41 process, mining has been added. I think certainly processing and recycling, hopefully, will be considered in the same category. And what that does is it spotlights a project. It puts its progress along the permitting timeline onto a public dashboard, and that helps to create more accountability. Also, simplify, I think, the process and tracking the projects. Are there things that what more can be done in the near term to try to bring more projects online along the timelines that are necessary here to achieve some of these ambitious battery and EV targets?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm only a little reluctant to address processes that fall
Understood.
outside of our role at the Department of Energy, right? But I think your question is a good one that I think is on our minds. In some of our work so far, we've tried to do what we can to sort of highlight some of the opportunities and maybe some of the barriers that are along the way. And for this type of work that you're talking about, and so I'll mention both the Federal Consortium for Advanced Batteries, FCAB, a joint group of 17 different federal agencies, including being led by the DOE, released a blueprint report that highlighted some of these and some of the goals we have for materials that I think could be helpful for those that are looking at doing this type of work or considering some of these barriers, as well as I'd like to point towards the LiveBridge Alliance and a few of the reports that they have released as well, which I think go into a few more details in terms of some of the development helpful in terms of, again, in terms of permitting and in terms of some of the near-term barriers that could be addressed to kind of grease the skids and try to roll out more of this work in the near term.
Thank you so much. And Kimberly, turning to you for a moment, what have you seen in terms of shifts in the North American supply chain, maybe as a result of recent public policy or in response to the dramatic growth of EV deployment and battery storage deployment in North America over the last several years?
If I could I also comment a little bit on the regulatory space? Matthew said that this is a live conversation in Canada as well, and it absolutely is. You know, we recognize that, you know, in order for us to be competitive, in order for us to achieve our laudable goals of reaching net zero by 2050, that we need to get the raw materials that we need to enable the rest of the work to happen. And I always say that critical minerals are the building blocks for the energy transition. And in order to have that transition, you need those minerals. And so we're actively working in Canada to really try to find ways of ensuring that we can have the process, the timelines shorter, while still maintaining the robust standards and the regulatory rigor that's required to ensure the high ESG standards that Canada is known for. And so, you know, one of the things that we've done is in our most recent budget, in budget 2023, we committed to the development of a concrete plan by the end of this calendar year to improve the efficiency of the impact assessment and permitting processes for major projects. It's going to include clarifying and reducing timelines, mitigating inefficiencies, and improving engagement and partnerships, including those with our Indigenous partners. And on a go-forward basis, those approvals must be done in a manner that ensures both environmental sustainability and respects the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples. So, you know, it is part of what attracts people to Canada, but we recognize that the timelines are still too long. We're also working with every single jurisdiction. So Canada, like the US, is a federation. Much of our mining is regulated by provinces and territories. And so we've set up regional energy and resource tables we're setting them up with every single jurisdiction. Currently, we have 9 provinces and territories on board. And one of the key focus of these tables is to establish joint goals, align resources, and focus on aligning and accelerating regulatory and permitting processes while we move forward. And we're doing this with Indigenous participation, with industry participation, and with labor participation. So we're bringing everybody into the tent and kind of saying, collectively, how do we move this forward in a better way? And in the last couple of months, we've actually approved a couple of mining projects. One is the Marathon Palladium project in Ontario, and the second is a James Bay lithium mine project in Quebec. So I think we're on the right track. We still have a lot of work to go, but happy to say that it is something that our government is very much seized with.
Fantastic, thank you. So with just 3 minutes left, we'll go to a lightning round, and I'm just going to relay a great question from Matthew here in the chat, which is, if you can share some thoughts on what else industry can do to provide governments with information that would catalyze extraction, processing, and manufacturing and help in these processes.
Sure, I'll start with, I think, a great question. I do think there are some more supporting details in terms of not only economic impacts that can be meaningful, but also some of the whether it's community benefits or whether it's more localized impacts, as well as agreements and work that that can be highlighted to try and better sort of buoy some of these efforts. I certainly can't say that I'm on the front lines of this type of work, but I do understand that those are the types of things that folks are looking for and are often asked for up front.
And if maybe I can just build upon that in the last couple of moments that we have, you know, governments on both sides of the border have put historic amounts of money on the table to kind of incent these industries and to help, you know, to be a catalyst for growth of local critical minerals value chains. What we need from industry is we need them to invest in these new industries, take advantage of those incentives so that together we can achieve the impacts that we need in North America. So what we need is we need to work collectively. We need to ensure that investments are complementary. We need to create resiliency and not redundancy. And, you know, I think we can do it. I think that together we can build better. Absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful chat. And Stephen, apologies for asking what may have been more of a political question, but thank you so much for all your insight into the batteries and critical material supply chain. And I think it's really wonderful and amazing to hear about all of the coordination that is underway between the United States and Canada during such a critical period. So again, thank you so much on all of our behalf for joining us and for this great discussion today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I am gonna kick it back over to Matthew for the next panel.
Thanks so much. And that really was a great discussion. And we're going to move now into a conversation with business leaders who are kind of, you know, live in this space and sort of taking on the risks and allocating capital, hiring people, and developing new and innovative technologies to get us to where we want to go. So it's a bit of the other side of the coin. We've heard the policy making side of things, and now this is the business making side of things. And I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you and what you just heard as well. So without any further delay, I'll introduce our second discussion. Happy to welcome Adam Johnson, who is the Senior Vice President of External Affairs at Nano One, Dr. Chris Burns, who's the CEO of Novonix, Harry Kumar, who is the Director of Government Relations for the Americas for Lifecycle, and finally, Austin Devaney, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at Piedmont Lithium. Welcome to all of you. Great to have you here. So I'm just going to get right into it because we want to save time for questions and discussion, and I'm not going to get into everybody's CV. So I guess my first question is find my first question. Sorry, Chris, I'm going to direct it at you actually. So, you know, Novonix is a battery innovator. It's involved in battery technologies as well as cathode and anode active materials, and you have research and production in both Canada and the US. So I'm wondering if you could start us off and maybe offer your thoughts at a high level on what maybe a successful outcome for a Canada-US supply chain could look like. And I'm going to ask each of you for your thoughts on this as well. So, you know, I'll move on from Chris and maybe to Austin, Harry, and Adam after that. Chris?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matthew. And it's great to be here and with everybody on the panel who we were all together in DC last week for the benchmark event as well, because this is such an important topic. And I think, you know, when you think about Andrew's comments at the beginning of this session around the need for these critical materials, a successful outcome looks like a diversity of options, right? A number of years ago, I think a lot of people around the table in North America, especially in the active materials markets, you know, viewed each other as competitors, right? And while that is the case, the market is huge. And success, if we think about one of our critical goals really being to reduce the reliance on China in this supply chain, is to have multiple people be very successful in growing within their space, right? So our focus, for example, in the synthetic graphite space, Andrew spoke about some of the challenges in the graphite market, it being overlooked, it being one of the most China-dominated markets. We were selected under the MESC award for a $150 million grant last year. And last week we announced an investment from LG in agreements around development of materials for them in the US market. But our goal is only to be a fraction of the local supply. And even that has significant challenges for us to achieve. So I think something that we need to think about, and the idea of investment that came up on the last panel, is success needs to look like a lot of active players in this market, not a couple winners.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks for that, Justin. And Austin, maybe I'll move on to you. Obviously, key building block for this industry is lithium, and Piedmont is developing projects in the US to feed into this ecosystem. Looking at this from the upstream perspective, I'll ask you the same question. What does success for North America look like for you?
Success to me is getting to where Andy Miller described, where we have a majority of our supply across the supply chain produced here in North America. That's really the biggest challenge we face. When you think about how our competitors, and I speak competitors as different nations. I heard Kimberly say foreign entities of concern. I think we all recognize kind of what that means. That's really the big risk that we face, is weaponizing energy. We've seen it with Russia do that through in Ukraine, the conflict there, and in the EU. So having some level of self-sufficiency is super important. So that's kind of what I envision the successful outcome being. And it's all about, fundamentally, it's not just about energy, but it's about jobs. Because when you think about what particularly China's trying to do with their battery supply chain, and they put forth a 5-year plan 3 plans ago, it was really about building an integrated supply chain from the beginning to the end. They didn't necessarily have all the natural resources we have here in North America, and that's what we have as kind of the ability to build out and have a successful outcome. So really, it is getting to we have some level of self-sufficiency.
Terrific. Harry, I'll go to you now. From Li-Cycle's perspective, which of course is a leading battery recycler with operations on both sides of the border, how do you think of success?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important question. I mean, I think when you look at the landscape right now, obviously there's significant investments occurring both in the US and Canada, but I think there's more to come. And so in the next decade, you want to see North America be a global leader in sustainable and innovative battery technology, production, recycling. I think Austin touched on it as well, but regionalization will be a key thing as well. We don't want to have to rely on creating these batteries by having to rely on unstable foreign supply chains or adverse actors to help source those critical minerals. And obviously that's an important focus for us at Li-Cycle. And I think overall is even broader, is developing an integrated North American clean energy plan. Yeah. Without competitive, cost-effective clean energy, the regionalization of supply chains and development of digital economies that are obviously based off a lot of this energy, it'll make it, without that, nearshoring in North America will be difficult to make a reality, as opposed to an idea. And then the final thing I would say is clear end-of-life management policies for lithium-ion batteries to ensure that there's a plan for these batteries to ensure that there's critical materials, as we all know, in all of these types of lithium-ion batteries. I think that needs to be a top-of-mind focus to ensure we're keeping that in our domestic North American supply chain, going to companies like us and others, because there's plenty of material out there.
That's great. Before I move to you, Adam, I'm going to invite participants to think about what others' perspectives on success are, and if there's anything you want to challenge, go for it. I mean, the North American Energy Plan it would be huge and ambitious, but really interesting to think about. Majority of supply coming from North America for our industry, fantastic, and obviously just a metric of much more activity, more firms involved would be fantastic. But Adam, I want to move to you now with the same question. I mean, look, Nano One, your facility in Quebec is currently the only LFP CAM production plant in North America, and I know you've been interested in seeing the North American approach work and play out positively. How do you think about kind of Canada-US success in the context of this industry?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity. Hello, everyone. And just really building on what my colleagues here on the panel have said. I think success is Americans and Canadians, along with our allies, really being leaders and not followers. I think we really do this through supporting innovation. It stands up a battery ecosystem from extraction to recycling here. As we said, many of us were at Benchmark last week. I've been in around politics and government and business for over 2 decades, and it's kind of surreal to see you've got everyone from the mining industry to chemical companies to government to auto OEMs all in the room trying to work through this and then working on the good data that Benchmark pulls together. So I think we're getting there, but it's a recognition that this is a generational opportunity, and that governments are listening. So I commend them for the amount of action they're putting into place, from funding to also the policy side. But we can't cut corners. There's important decisions being made. Tomorrow, I'm sure many of us have either put in papers or will put in papers around 30D. There was a letter from a certain senator that got a little bit of press with some of his strong views, and I'm sure there'll be many more. So we need to get this right. I think if we're going to truly establish a resilient supply chain that's going to make generational changes, it can be done. The companies here are doing it. Yesterday, we announced a joint development agreement with Our Next Energy, or One. This will see, if everything goes according to plan, iron coming from northern Quebec, processed at Rio Tinto's plant in Sorel, Quebec, moved to us outside of Montreal, processed, made into CAM, and then shipped to Detroit to put into a cell with One. That's just one example. And to what others have said, we're just trying to move this thing forward and take a piece of it, because it is so great. It's not only just going to be batteries, it's going to be all sorts of energy transitions to get us to where we need to get. So we all need to work together and have these conversations. Otherwise, we're not going to get there.
That's super helpful, and you'll have the opportunity, if you want, to sort of expand on your thoughts on 30D, because the next question really is about policy mechanisms. And if others want to talk about that specific issue, please feel free to. But I want to sort of just get your perspectives. And Harry, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Adam and Austin, and then Chris. What policy mechanisms you think would be most useful to drive sort of a more successful and integrated North American ecosystem? Harry, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, developing policies that facilitate and fund cross-border supply chains for critical materials and battery production, like Adam mentioned about 30D vehicle credits in the IRA, that's going to be a very important one. And obviously the life cycle, we welcome the passage of the IRA and bipartisan infrastructure law. We believe both will be key accelerators for the developing critical minerals and battery supply chain. I think the big thing on that, though, is the passage of those laws was critical, but the implementation will be just as important, if not even more important, because as we've seen, there's a lot of different companies in the space, and there's a lot of different thoughts on structure and how this should work. So I think it's critically important that we get this right, and that we make sure that we're helping boost this domestic supply chain in North America, while also realizing that, there are certain areas where we are still in the creation phase and trying to build up and scale. And so we may need to rely on some of our, key partners in other nations, such as South Korea and others. So I think it's really important to focus on the implementation side on those, and then as well, continuing. Obviously, Canada put out some legislation earlier this year, or budget earlier this year, which was people called like a response to the IRA, but we thought it was very targeted, very smart, very focused, and so I think it's important that the IRA is kind of an inspiration to Canada and also Mexico. We want to bring along all of North America to kind of push forward this investment and help companies figure out which, how to best invest in across the continent.
Yes, sort of a race to the top scenario. Adam, I'll go back to you, and you can touch on 30D even more if you'd like. But just generally speaking, kind of what mechanisms you've seen, whether they be in North America already or elsewhere, or what you think might be useful to help drive this forward.
Sure. I mean, I look at this stuff from kind of a public policy and communications front quite often. I think we need to recognize of how we got here. Like, why is this all happening? It happened for a few reasons. One was, the supply chain challenges, to put it mildly, that we all realized that the West deals with coming through COVID, and how inadequate that was. Obviously, the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia has really changed things. And then more broadly, as we're all dealing with, a climate crisis. We were in DC all coughing and hacking from smoke. It's amazing how I'm watching on the news that there's now firefighting teams being moved around the world, and this is the new reality. So there's real challenges that are there that have led to this. I'd also suggest that we got to look about, like, what kind of a battery ecosystem do we want? As people mentioned earlier, again, as you mentioned earlier, the issue is that people forget about the midstream and don't realize the importance of it. Is this about, slapping batteries between four wheels and getting as many on the road? Or is this by doing something right and kind of looking at some of the drivers that got us here? And I think we need to pause. I think we need to, we don't have time to pause, but in our spare moments, we need to stop and think about what the larger drivers are. And that's, going to be, like I said, innovation. It's going to be protecting IP. It's going to be, as Harry said, investing in companies that are the next generational ones. That's going to get us to the point where this is going to create good paying jobs. Practically speaking, yes, the IIJ, IRA, Government of Canada programs have been great. They are fast tracking a lot of investments at this breakneck pace, which is a challenge, but it's also good. But I don't think we can't lose sight of the importance of the midstream as batteries become the new oil. If we're moving off the PCAM and CAM offshore and making it more complicated, we're not going to hit the outcomes we want. So I won't go specifically into 30D, but that's kind of, I think, some of the broader perspectives we need to think about as we're doing this. Otherwise, we're just going to be pulling rocks out of the ground, shipping it to other places, processed to be brought back here, which is, I don't think, the intent of people and what voters would think.
Yeah, I know that's really helpful, Adam. Thanks. Austin, same question to you. What you sort of see as being good drivers from a policy perspective to move this forward?
Well, first, let me say I'm offended that Adam would think I just pulling rocks out of the ground. Just joking. Like any leader would do, and you've heard people say it before, I'm going to tell you there are three things that I would focus on from policies that would be helpful to building out the industry. The first is legislative reform. I point to legislative reform because so many people get caught up in calling it permitting reform, and it's really inside of permitting reform. It's legislative reform. It's not legislative. It is the liability and litigation reform around permitting. It's the ability to stop projects by filing lawsuits that don't fall into the national interest of what our countries are trying to accomplish in developing a battery supply chain. So that could be at a local level, a state level, a federal level. And that litigation is really the challenge that many times projects face, both at the extractive level, the midstream level, and even down to operations that are just regular industrial operations. Adam mentioned, and I think it's super important, when you look at the lithium-ion supply chain, nearly all of the intellectual property was developed here in Canada and the United States. We've been the leaders in developing IP, and we've allowed that IP to move outside of our countries. And so that's super important to protect that IP so that it protects our industries, gives them a competitive advantage. And then helping my friend out, Harry, I would describe to you, it's a battery DNA. It's making sure we keep those minerals in our supply chain and not allowing countries to take part in the incentives that we put in place under the IRA to bring materials through countries that we have free trade agreements with, and subrogate some of the things that the IRA is in incentivizing. So I want to see that the lithium that qualifies for 30D, I want to make sure that has actually come from a free trade agreement country partner that the United States and Canada have as partners. I don't want to see it come from China through South Korea into the United States. And that's really a critical piece, is having some form of a battery DNA. They've got the EU battery passport. We maybe don't need to go to that same level, but we need to make sure the critical materials are protected.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And Chris, embedded in that, Austin mentioned sort of IP and innovation, and obviously North America has been a real leader in this space for years and years, and Novonix is part of that story. And so I want to sort of turn to you now and get your thoughts on the North American ecosystem and what policies could help kind of shape this better than it is.
Yeah, first, I agree with everything that the folks have said here already, because we're actually doing so many of the right things, right? And when you look at, we get asked this type of question all the time: what more can the government be doing? And if you look at face value, for example, in the US, Novonix was selected for a $150 million grant. We have a loan program application in for a significant potential loan support for a facility. There's 48C and 45X production or capital investment credits. There's a Section 301 tariff on graphite. And there's the 30D vehicle credits to incentivize localization. But the problem is actually how complicated it is to implement all of that, right? So if grants and loans can't be used together, if 48C and 45X can't contribute toward cost share, the tariff has a waiver on it, foreign entity of concern language is still in question in 30D, the building blocks are all there and they're all set and they're all actually, being put in place. But part of the challenge is clarity on the implementation of all of this, to avoid things like Austin said, Chinese material making its way through 50% value add in Korea and then coming into the United States, and some of what we'll call loopholes to what's the clear intention of the government policies. So I think the government is doing, frankly, a great job, and the US is leading this effort, I think, and Canada is doing well as well. But clarity in these policies is critical to address something that Kimberly said: bring private sector investment to the table. We're in a very challenging macroeconomic climate for growth and future growth companies, many of whom live in this Western world battery material supply chain because it hasn't existed for the 30 years that lithium-ion batteries have been here. So, we need certainty from these government policies in order to bring to the table the commercial partners, the financing partners, and all of this to build the supply chain out. Because while batteries have been around for 30 years and I've talked about this, we're only now trying to ramp production outside of Asia. And we're trying to do it from essentially starting when everybody, when the Fords and GMs of the world really started making these commitments to building all of these facilities here. And we had a 5-year window, and everyone looked around the table, to your point about technology, and there's a huge number of companies developing technology in the country, or in North America. But how many of them are commercial ready? How many of them are ready to scale and actually make an impact in 2025, 2026, when we're going to have this huge demand locally? So I think the government's doing a great job to put the framework in place, but it's a very complex framework to address so many verticals in the supply chain, and continuing to bring clarity to that unified intention and mission of these policies is going to be very important.
Yeah, and you mentioned private investment. That's where I want to go next. And I'll come back to you in a second, Chris, because if we've got all of this innovation, all these new technologies coming online, it's going to take a huge amount of capital to get them to commercial scale, and then even then, got to make sure they survive. And we've got more acute challenges in Canada in terms of IP and keeping IP in Canada as well. That's one of the realities of living next to the United States. But that's for another day. But I do want to sort of maybe ask the panelists their thoughts on how to drive investment into this space. I was going to ask about public investment as well, but maybe let's just stick to private investment for the moment, because we've talked a lot about, you know, the role of governments in making sure that there is funding for a lot of these projects. So maybe just thinking about private investment for a second, how can we get more money into this space from the market side? Maybe Austin, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks, Matthew. That is one of my favorite topics. You know, when you look at, you know, one of the things that Andy Miller from Benchmark didn't reference was the fact that in the lithium space, 2/3 of the capacity needed globally will come from junior developers, unfinanced companies, and that having access to private financing really is critical to be able to bridge some of that $50 billion gap that he described. And one of the things that I find I chafe at a lot is the idea that many people want the next new shiny thing. Lithium ion technology has been developed to a level that it can provide the energy needs for light duty transportation. And you hear so many times people talking about lithium air batteries or lithium metal anodes or hydrogen fuel cells, so many other technologies. And when you look at the blueprint that China's laid down, they said lithium ion, lithium ion, lithium ion, lithium ion, and they built out a whole supply chain around lithium ion. And we have policymakers who say, well, we want the next new thing. That's what we want to focus on. And so that's all fine and good. But the challenge that it faces is private investors hear that and they say, well, your company's probably not going to be in existence 5 or 8 years from now. And so why should I invest in you? I mean, I see Chris shaking my head. And how many times does he hear someone talk about silicon anodes or some other type of anode technology? Sodium ion batteries have been making the round for the last 6 months. And that really is a big distraction in our industry of there's some new technology out there that's going to put all of these businesses behind the 8 ball when they're trying to go in front of investors.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Austin. Thanks. And I know you don't mean let's stop innovating. Of course, we want to see new technologies, but I take the point about investors needing kind of some understanding of what ROI will look like for them. Chris, maybe I'll go to you now for your thoughts on this question.
Well, I'll just, rewind and repeat Austin, I think, but, it's incredibly true. And it goes back to the idea of certainty from government policies and certainty from a technology landscape. And Andrew spoke about it, 30 years of a lithium ion battery, but what's really changed? It's a mixed metal cathode instead of a cobalt cathode, and it's a graphite anode instead of a hard carbon anode. It's materially the same battery today, 30 years later. So part of the challenge is this, and he made this reference, looking at new technologies and hearing about the next big thing. And there has to be a healthy balance, because as you said, we need to innovate and we need to be looking at how these future technologies will be deployed. And I do think both the investor education, the public education, and the government education has improved astronomically over the past 5 years in understanding that these are not light switches, right? Just because there's one other successful technology doesn't mean everything else falls by the wayside. And I was on a panel with Shirley Meng a couple of years ago, and this question was kind of asked, right? How do you deal with the idea of breakthroughs, right? And she basically apologized on the behalf of academics and said, well, we have to use the word breakthrough because we need to get funded to keep doing research, right? But you have to realize when you see a picture and, in the journal or anywhere of somebody holding up a coin cell and calling it a breakthrough, this has 10 years before it has a chance of ever entering the market, right? And that's still a chance. So, we're seeing that sophisticated investors are understanding that technologies that are here today are here for the long haul, but it doesn't change the fact that there's an astronomical gap in financing. And the critical part is how can you validate your technology and how can you bring strategic partners to your organization to give confidence to not just the private sector, but the public sector to support the initiatives that need to be built, whether it's plants, mines, recycling centers, or others.
Adam, I remember having a conversation with your CEO somewhat recently about coverage, analyst coverage, and there wasn't a heck of a lot of analyst coverage for Nano One. And I think there's a story to that. Where does it fit in? What categories it fit into? But that was in the context of just invested into the broader industry. And I'll pose the same question to you, and maybe challenges that you've seen. And I take Chris's point that these strategic partnerships are hugely important with bigger companies, right? And you spoke about one at the top end of this conversation. So maybe your thoughts on how to drive more investment into the space.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, building on some of the things that Austin and Chris said. I mean, we often get calls from people saying, "Well, I did a really good job of selling cannabis stocks before. Now I can come sell yours." I mean, there's a lot of hype in the industry. We don't return their calls, but there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of people saying that they've got the next great mousetrap or mouse, and so there's you've got that, and as a publicly traded company, that causes challenges because obviously we got to be very truthful about everything we say and can't lead people. At the same time, on the flip side, you've got auto OEMs that are trying to learn this space that have very, very, very long and very rigorous testing cycles. And as a company that is bringing innovation and a bit of a disruptive technology, we see the major players not necessarily always wanting to be too public with us because of concern of disrupting the apple cart of the traditional way of doing it. So it's a balancing act of educating people in sessions like this. Having governments backing and supporting has been really helpful for us. But I think taking it back up to the original question around how do we drive public and private investment, I think it's really, as much as we can, get the politics out of this. Obviously, this has become a geopolitical hot button issue. Questions about funding, how long it lasts. Yes, funding can't go on forever, but having certainty and knowing that this transition is happening, it's here, will allow us up for success. And I think it comes back to something I said earlier, which is we also need to make sure that people are seeing the broad goals of why we're doing this align with their values. Because if they aren't seeing the jobs, if they aren't seeing the environmental side, if they aren't seeing the security aspects of this, and that it's going to continue to cause us challenges. So creating that certainty, having governments investing in that next generational technology, which for us, we say we're next gen, but we're talking 2 or 3 years from now, versus when that next line comes on, versus just saying, okay, we'll bring the old dirty ways of making cathode or whatever it is, and let's do that for the next 50 years. So we got to drive innovation, and government's got to back that.
Yeah, really helpful. Thanks. And Henry, I'll go over to you with the same question. Obviously, Chris had talked about validated technology and life cycles there, and got a great story to tell. Maybe you can, walk us through a little bit how conversations with investors go for you, or what you're seeing in that space, and how we could drive more private investment into this space, or even public investment, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's obviously a critical area. I mean, for us, we were founded in 2016, and my CEO talks all the time about when he would say what the business model was back then, and recycling batteries. People would look at him like, this is crazy. But you go fast forward a few years later, and it's become such a hot issue. I think in terms of private sector investment, it's obviously critical. We were fortunate in that we went public on the NYSE in 2021 and received a significant cash infusion from that. But even prior to that, while we were before our commercial stage, we were fortunate to get some government funding from the Canadian government to help us in some of that more early stage stuff. And I think when you look at that, I think that's something that really needs to be looked at closely, is that the traditional, I think, venture VC model doesn't necessarily work with clean tech companies and investment, especially, I think, there was a lot of money lost in around 2010, 2011, it was a hot investment area, and some of those investments, obviously didn't pan out. But I think part of that is because the model doesn't necessarily cleanly fit. It wasn't that the companies didn't have a good idea or, something that could work. It was just, you only have a certain amount of runway, and for clean tech, that runway just needs to be longer in a lot of cases. I think touching on, for kind of earlier stage, I think if there's ways, for public policymakers, and I think that, IRA and other legislation has helped somewhat in this, but lowering the risk of those clean tech investments is certainly a key. Increased support to startups and private investors to provide an alternative to VC funding, and then also increasing access for those clean tech entrepreneurs to federally funded research centers and university labs and private research institutes. So it helps kind of build their knowledge base, build their technology, and kind of, help them kind of scale to where they feel comfortable with the investment, and that they'll be able to capitalize and make return on that investment. I think those are all, kind of key areas to make sure that new entrants to the market are able to succeed as well.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to do a bit of I think I'll use the word lightning round, so I'm going to use the same term. I'm going to sort of do it in this order: Adam, Chris, Austin, and then Harry. If you could do one thing, or if you could suggest one thing that is needed to progress a North American supply chain ecosystem and just put everybody in a better position, your companies, everybody on this call, what would it be? Would it be in the realm of public support or education or trade? Kind of an open-ended question, but I prepped you for it, so you've had a few hours to think about it at least. Adam, do you have any sort of a magic bullet?
Sure. I don't have a magic bullet other than to say, I think we need to recognize, look around Nano when we talk about what are the big boulders we need to take out of the lake that's overfilling with water, right? There's lots of boulders, but what's the big one we pull out to get that water level down a bit? So I think it's figuring out where there's the really big challenges, working with government industry. One example I heard recently was that there's only one factory in the world that makes kilns. It's in Korea. There's 400 people that work at it. It's now a 2 or 3 year wait to get it built. So how do we stand up different parts of the supply chain that will enable the localization of it, but also, create that innovation?
That's great. Chris?
I think we've talked about so many of the things, but I think I'll go back to kind of trade relations, right? I think that the public policy on the foreign entities of concern and the need for localization really needs to be firmed up and put in place, because the lack of certainty has a huge impact, not just in today, but all the companies around this table are working on trying to secure contracts that work over many, many years. And when you're trying to look at forward pricing materials or services or anything like this, and you're competing against the currently operating Chinese market, frankly speaking, it can be night and day, and it can lead to challenges, especially in markets that can't rely on publicly traded metals and LME and things like this. So I think really getting in front of the trade relations and putting clear certainty to address those agenda items is going to be absolutely critical to seeing localization in the next few years.
Terrific. Thanks. Austin?
Education, and Adam referenced it. When we talk about climate change and what electric vehicles do, because that's really the big market for all of us, that's it. It's the efficiency, it's battery life. I talk to so many people who believe that the batteries are going to fail in a short period of time, and they're going to last a really long time. I have a Mustang Mach-E. I fully anticipate that car will last 300, 400,000 miles based on today's technology and cycle lives. And too many people think that they're just going to fail much earlier. My car is 3 times as efficient as an internal combustion engine in converting BTUs to miles driven. And I think that gets lost on people, and they think that EVs are just for, really rich people or for really niche applications. I think what you have to focus on is the ability to improve our climate. And really, that is an education effort. And when you talk about how batteries have evolved, and Chris mentioned a couple times, from 30 years ago when Sony had an LCO battery to supply, their camcorder, that was a breakthrough. But now we're in this point that light duty transportation will be moving to batteries, and we need to educate people more on why that's a good thing.
Perfect. Thanks. And Harry, last word to you, and then I'll invite you to come back in to close us out.
Yeah, sure. And Austin, next time I'm in Charlotte, I'd love to get a ride in that car. It sounds fantastic. I think in terms of what more is needed, I think it's something that's starting to get talked about more, but really should be a top of mind. I think when people talk about this area and talk about hiring, they're focused more on the companies. How fast are you hiring? How fast are you scaling? But I think equally, if not more important, is the hiring on the government side. Because some of these agencies and sub-agencies really were very small offices, didn't have many people. And I know they're moving at breakneck speed to try to hire more and more. But I mean, even now with the amount of company like applications for grants, loans, etc., they're seeing so much demand and a really strained workforce from folks who are working as hard as they can, but they simply just need more manpower there. So I think ensuring in order to really, that goes back to the implementation side. The funds are great, the investment's great, but we got to be able to implement it. And on the government side, you need significantly increased hiring to make sure that they're able to process and administer these programs effectively.
Fantastic. Listen, thank you all very much. Great conversation. I'm going to invite Albert to come back in and close us out. But thanks again. Really, really informative.
Well, thank you all so much. And Matthew, that was a great panel. Really fantastic group that joined us today. So just to wrap up quickly, I wanted to, I know, Matthew, we're going to work on a follow-up document to summarize some of the things we heard. I wanted to go through a few things that I heard that I think were particularly meaningful today. Adam mentioned the recent phenomenon of the Canadian wildfire smoke enveloping New York and DC, which was a really poignant reminder of how not only how close we are as neighboring countries, but also how small the world is and how little national borders matter when you're talking about emissions put up into the atmosphere. But what I heard today was, a great summary of an enormous opportunity and success to the folks that joined us today means the United States and Canada leading the world in the right direction by working together. There's a new coalition of groups, stakeholders, companies that have not worked together before in this type of focused way to drive change, but that together represent millions of jobs and millions of dollars, billions of dollars of investment in future growth. And that's really important when you're talking about making good, lasting policy that provides a framework for making those investments and other business decisions necessary to accomplish that task. And to that point, both the United States and the Canadian governments are allocating significant resources toward greater coordination, and contained within those efforts are a lot of opportunities for industry to provide governments with information that can accelerate the deployment of a North American battery supply chain. Recent policy has created a really strong, compelling framework for accelerating production of critical minerals, battery components, electric vehicles in North America. And we heard about the importance of maintaining predictability and policy certainty going forward, given the speed and scale of private investment here and the innovation curve in both the mineral and battery production sectors, and the degree to which each link in this growing regional supply chain really depends upon the strength of the other links. And this includes the downstream parts of the supply chain, the further development of the downstream market for electric vehicles of all classes, and the continued integration of energy storage into the grid. Also, in the last panel, heard Adam say, let's get the politics out of this, which, as we all know, is really difficult, sometimes impossible. But this is a really compelling issue that has a really broad base of support. We have, in the United States, we have an industrial policy in place that, if successfully implemented, will create millions of jobs across the country in manufacturing and the electricity supply sector. It will secure supply chains for critical minerals and batteries, put us on a realistic pathway to decarbonizing the transportation and power sectors, And the world has changed a lot over the last decade or so, decade and a half. And we're not talking, when we talk about job growth, economic development, investment, we're not talking about training coal miners to install solar panels. This is creating opportunities for folks who've worked in the mineral sector to apply their knowledge and expertise to these challenges and opportunities. And people who've built cars for decades in states like Tennessee and Michigan and many others to build batteries and electric vehicles. I heard an enormous amount of enthusiasm at the Benchmark conference last week from folks who had come into the battery industry from several other industries, extraction, infrastructure, from the fossil fuel industry, who were so excited, and we're driving a lot of new energy enthusiasm and innovation in the industry, and you can really feel it in the room. So, but the major takeaway from all the participants today is just that the public policy framework really has created a unique opportunity for coordination and collaboration between the United States and Canada, and one that can provide enormous benefits to both countries. So, Matthew, I want to kick it to you for your thoughts as well before we wrap up.
Well, look, I think you've given a great summary of what we've heard. So I won't go on. Some really great food for thought from all of our participants. I particularly enjoyed hearing the eagerness on the government to government side to collaborate and cooperate and find ways to progress the supply chain for all the reasons we know we have to do it, and to hear the novel thoughts and actions from our industry panel. So with that, I will sort of rest my case, as it were. And as you mentioned, we're going to go produce an outcomes document for this conversation. So we will send that to participants. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And thank you very much, Albert, and to your ZETA team for being such great collaborators on this.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for all the work you put into organizing this. And thanks to everyone for joining. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.